The chamber was quiet enough to hear the shuffle of papers, the subtle clearing of throats, the hollow echo of boots on the marble floor. Then, cutting through that fragile silence, came the voice of Senator Ted Cruz. His tone was sharp, dripping, with mockery, designed to sting rather than to persuade. He leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, eyes narrowed as if he had already won before the contest had even begun. "You know," he said, pausing just long enough to let his words hang like smoke in the air. "Some people come here with passion, sure, but passion without discipline, that's nothing more than noise, and boy, do we hear a lot of noise from you." It was a jab meant to belittle, meant to reduce Representative Jasmine Crockett to nothing more than a caricature. Loud, emotional, unworthy of serious attention. Cruz chuckled under his breath, as if the insult were a private joke shared only with those who thought like him. But it wasn't private. It was public. Every camera was rolling, every microphone was live, and every person in that room felt the heat of the moment. A hush fell. The smirk on Cruz's face widened, satisfied. With the silence, he expected no real reply, only a flustered defense or an awkward attempt to change the subject. That was the game he had played countless times before. Provoke, mock, retreat behind smugness. But this time, something shifted. You could see, in the faces of those around the table, a flicker of disbelief, then anticipation. Staffers glanced up from their notes, eyebrows raised. Reporters leaned forward just a little closer. The tension coiled like a spring. Jasmine Crockett sat, still her hands folded, her gaze fixed. No fluster, no retreat, only quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the arrogant suddenly uncertain. The air grew heavy, as if the entire chamber knew something. Cruz did not. He had crossed a line, and in doing so, he had opened a door he would soon regret, because Crockett was about to respond. Not with noise, not with hesitation, but with precision. And what she said next would silence him like never before. This moment in the chamber was never just about a single jab, or even a clash, between two elected officials. It was bigger, heavier, charged with the weight of something far deeper than one man's mockery. When Ted Cruz tried to cut Jasmine Crockett down, he wasn't only speaking to her. He was speaking to every woman who had been told to stay quiet, to every young leader dismissed as too inexperienced, to every voice of color pushed aside in rooms where power has always felt entitled to sit comfortably. Cruz, polished in the art of condescension, represented a well-worn tradition in American politics. Arrogance cloaked as authority, privilege, packaged as wisdom. His remarks echoed the tired narrative that power belonged to the same old guard, to men who believed that volume equaled strength, and that smugness was the same as intelligence. He embodied the past, a past unwilling to let go. But Jasmine Crockett, she was something else entirely. She represented the present colliding with the future. Unapologetic, fierce, and unmistakably authentic. She wasn't trying to fit into the mold that politics had long forced on women, especially women of color. She wasn't softening her edges to make others comfortable. She wasn't here to wait her turn. She was here to claim her space, and by doing so she carried with her the energy of a generation no longer willing to shrink itself down to appease fragile egos. Every time Jasmine spoke, she spoke with the cadence of someone who knew her words weren't just her own. They belonged to communities that had been silenced, to families that had sacrificed, to people who had been told. Their stories didn't matter. That authenticity radiated in her presence. It's what made her impossible to ignore, no matter how much Cruz tried to drown her out with smirks and cheap insults. And that's why the tension in the chamber mattered so much. It wasn't theater, it wasn't entertainment. It was a collision of two Americas, the one clinging desperately to arrogance and the one demanding recognition, justice, and respect. The clash was symbolic of a cultural crossroads, a reckoning playing out not only in politics, but across workplaces, classrooms, and households. In that silence after Cruz's remark, everyone could feel it. They knew what was coming next was more than a rebuttal. It was a turning point. It was the kind of reply that doesn't just defend the individual, it shifts the conversation entirely. Because Jasmine Crockett was not there to play the same old game, to smile politely and let the insult slide. She was there to prove that arrogance had finally met its match, and when she spoke, it would become clear. This wasn't about one insult. It was about history catching up to arrogance. Ted Cruz has never been a stranger to the spotlight. He thrives on it. The lights, the microphones, the chance to play the sharp-tongued conservative warrior on camera. For years, it has been his trademark. Turn every exchange into theater, every disagreement into a stage for smug performance. His political career has been shaped less by building bridges and more by burning them, convinced that scorched earth is the path to applause. From the earliest days of his Senate career, Cruz positioned himself as the provocateur. He filibustered for hours, reading children's books on the Senate floor, not to change minds but to feed his brand as the outsider who could mock the establishment. He relished the eye rolls and the groans, convinced they proved he was shaking up Washington. But behind the bluster lay a consistent truth. His theatrics often left him isolated, distrusted even by his own party. That arrogance became clearest in moments of crisis. During the devastating Texas winter storm of 2021, millions of his constituents shivered in the dark, without heat or water. And Cruz? He was photographed boarding a plane to Cancun, suitcase in hand, leaving behind the state he was supposed to represent. When the backlash came, he scrambled with excuses, blaming his daughters, claiming he only intended to escort them. The arrogance of it all was breathtaking, a senator abandoning his people, then expecting them to accept a flimsy explanation. For many, it was the moment his mask of self-proclaimed patriotism cracked wide open. But Cruz had a long record of contradictions before and after that. He once branded Donald Trump a sniveling coward, publicly lambasting the man for insulting his wife and father. Yet, when the political winds shifted, he bent the knee, becoming one of Trump's most loyal defenders. Principle was always negotiable for Cruz, so long as it secured him more airtime and influence. His critics saw it as proof of a man who wielded words not out of conviction, but out of convenience. In hearings, he perfected the art of the smug insult. He mocked colleagues for their intelligence, dismissed witnesses with sarcasm, and turned serious questions into partisan sound bites. Time and again, his goal wasn't truth, it was humiliation. Theatrics over substance always, and yet this brand of arrogance rarely delivered the victories he imagined. His 2016 presidential campaign began with fiery declarations that he was the true conservative savior. It ended with rejection not just from voters but from fellow Republicans who openly admitted they couldn't stomach him. Lindsey Graham once quipped that if Cruz were murdered on the Senate floor, not a single senator would convict his killer. It was a biting joke, but one rooted in a reputation Cruz himself had built. Too arrogant to trust, too self-serving to follow still, Cruz carried on with the same swagger. He wore the disdain of colleagues as a badge of honor, mistaking contempt for fear. To him, the groans, the ridicule, the eye rolls meant he was winning. He relished playing the villain because he believed villains controlled the narrative. But arrogance has limits. What Cruz never accounted for was what would happen when his theatrics collided with someone who refused to play along, someone who would not shrink beneath his smugness or be baited into a clumsy defense. He had built his career on the assumption that his opponents would falter, that they would fumble, stumble, or lose their temper. That was his formula. Push hard enough, and the other side would crumble under the weight of his disdain. Jasmine Crockett was different. She was not going to give him the reaction he counted on. She was not going to stumble or lash out. She was not there to play his game, and that made her dangerous in a way Cruz had not anticipated. And so, when he turned his smirk in her direction, when he delivered his jab meant to belittle and silence, he believed it would end as it always had, with him standing taller, satisfied that he'd won another exchange. But on this day, his usual games would backfire spectacularly. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever sat beneath the glare of congressional lights, before her name flashed across headlines or her speeches went viral online, she was a young black woman trying to carve out a place in a world that too often told her she didn't belong. Her story wasn't polished in privilege or cushioned by inherited influence. It was a story born out of grit, struggle, and the relentless will to fight not just for herself, but for the communities that raised her. Growing up, Jasmine saw firsthand the barriers stacked against people who looked like her. She witnessed neighbors working 2 or 3 jobs just to keep food on the table, families forced to navigate a system that never seemed designed for their success. She saw injustice up close, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily reality. And instead of hardening her, it lit something inside her. It gave her a mission, to use her voice as a weapon, to make sure silence was never the default for those without power. That path led her into law. Becoming an attorney was never just about personal ambition. It was about defense. Defense of those society wrote off, defense of the voiceless, defense of dignity. As a public defender, she stood beside people the system was eager to discard, often fighting uphill battles with limited resources against structures designed to crush the powerless. It was exhausting, unglamorous work. There were late nights spent poring over files no one else cared about, early mornings where she faced clients who had already been told 100 times that no one could save them. And still, she fought. That resilience came with sacrifices. While others in politics were building donor networks and cozying up to powerful insiders, Jasmine was scraping together what she could to keep her practice alive, often putting her own financial stability at risk because she refused to turn away the people who needed her most. She wasn't chasing titles. She wasn't angling for status. She was, in every sense, fighting the kind of battles that grind most people down. And yet, those battles prepared her. They gave her scars, but they also gave her steel. When she eventually stepped into politics, it wasn't as a polished insider, or as someone handpicked by party bosses. It was as the underdog, the outsider who refused to stay quiet. She campaigned not with empty platitudes, but with the urgency of someone who had lived what she was fighting against. Voters felt it. They heard in her words not just speeches, but truth, authenticity, fire. And what set Jasmine apart was her refusal to tone down who she was. She spoke with the cadence of her roots, the rhythm of her people, the authenticity of someone who never tried to sand down her edges to fit neatly into Washington's sterile mold. That pride in her identity wasn't a liability. It was her power. She carried with her the struggles of Black women who had been silenced, the resilience of immigrants who had built new lives from nothing, the determination of every marginalized voice that had ever been told to wait your turn. That authenticity came at a cost. Critics mocked her style, dismissed her passion as anger, tried to belittle her as inexperienced or unfit, but each attempt only sharpened her resolve. She didn't back away. She leaned in. Every insult became fuel, every slight a reminder of why her fight mattered. And slowly, the underdog became the hero. She was no longer just the young attorney fighting for clients others abandoned. She was a congresswoman fighting for communities others ignored. She carried herself not with the arrogance of someone entitled to power, but with the resilience of someone who had bled for every inch of it. That is what made her dangerous, too. Men like Ted Cruz. He had mastered the art of the staged insult, the smug takedown. But Jasmine was built in a different fire. She wasn't rattled by mockery because she had heard worse and endured worse. She wasn't intimidated by arrogance because she had stood toe-to-toe with systems designed to crush her. In that chamber, when Cruz delivered his jab, Jasmine didn't just hear a personal insult. She heard the echoes of every dismissive comment, aimed at women like her, every attempt to silence voices that refused to conform. And she knew that her response would not only defend her dignity, but would carry the weight of countless others who saw themselves in her. She was the underdog turned hero, shaped by struggle, sharpened by sacrifice, and ready for the moment. Arrogance thought it could break her, and as the silence stretched after Cruz's words, it was clear. Jasmine Crockett was prepared for this exact moment. The chamber was restless. the kind of restlessness that comes when words cut sharper than knives. Ted Cruz leaned back in his chair, smug as ever, his smirk a weapon he'd honed for years. He interrupted with the casual arrogance of a man who believed the room was his stage. "Congresswoman Crockett," he sneered, stretching her name like an insult. "Maybe if you spent less time chasing headlines and more time reading the Constitution, you'd understand the basics." The jab drew a chuckle from his allies. It was the same old Cruz performance. Theater first, truth second, arrogance, always. He reveled in the echo of his own voice, convinced that the room existed only to amplify him. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't even raise her voice. Instead, she leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed, body calm, like a storm, gathering quietly in the distance. Her silence unsettled him. He wanted fireworks, a quick reaction, something to exploit. Instead, he found a wall of poise. Cruz pushed harder. "I know facts can be difficult for some to grasp, but maybe we could bring this down to a level you'd understand." His words dripped with condescension, heavy with the tone that so many women, and especially women of color, had endured in halls of power for generations. The room shifted again. Some eyes rolled, others tightened. A few in his corner smirked, but most sensed a line was being crossed. The arrogance was predictable, but the venom felt sharper, uglier. Cruz, oblivious, kept going. "Honestly," he said, gesturing with mock sympathy, "this is why serious debates are left to serious people. You're simply not cut out for this stage." A hush fell. Even his allies stopped laughing. It wasn't just a barb anymore. It was a dismissal, a declaration that she didn't belong, that her voice was lesser, her presence disposable, the kind of insult that lingered like smoke in the lungs. Jasmine didn't move. She let the words hang, let the weight of his contempt fill the chamber. She had endured worse in her journey here, and she knew patience was power. With every second she refused to break, the tension grew. Viewers leaned closer to their screens, sensing something was about to give. Cruz mistook her silence for weakness. "See? Nothing to say," he jeered, "because deep down even you know you're out of your depth." That was the moment, the spark, the insult that turned condescension into open challenge. The kind of moment history seizes and refuses to let go. Her eyes sharpened, her breath steady. The fire was there now, visible to anyone watching closely. She had given him all the rope he needed, and he had tied the noose himself. What came next would not be loud. It would not be rushed. It would be devastating in its precision. The chamber leaned forward, the silence electric, waiting for her reply, because this time, Jasmine Crockett was about to speak. And what she said would not only silence Ted Cruz. It would leave him stunned, exposed, and shaken in a way he had never been before. Then came the final insult, the spark that lit the fire. The chamber was still, the silence pressing down like a storm about to break. All eyes were on Jasmine Crockett. Ted Cruz had just delivered his final sneering insult, his smirk carved into the room like graffiti. He thought he had won. Thought. His words had cut her down to size, but Jasmine did not crumble. She rose. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened in her seat, her presence alone commanding more authority than his bluster ever could. Her gaze was steady, her voice calm, but beneath that calm lay steel. "Senator Cruz," she began, her tone measured, deliberate, almost gentle, and that gentleness was more lethal than a shout. "You've spent so much time perfecting your sneer. You've forgotten the one thing this chamber deserves: respect." A ripple moved through the room. She had not raised her voice, but every word struck with clarity. Cruz shifted slightly, not used to being answered with composure. He thrived on chaos, on shouting matches he could dominate. But this was different. "You call me unprepared, unserious, unworthy of this stage," she continued. "But let's be honest, Senator, that's projection. Because if anyone in this room has turned serious debate into a circus act, it's you." Gasps broke out. A few heads turned toward Cruz. His smirk faltered just slightly, the first crack in his carefully crafted mask. She pressed forward, her rhythm tightening like a drumbeat. You parade yourself as a constitutional scholar, yet you challenge the very principles you swore to uphold. You speak of unity while profiting off division. And now you stand here belittling me, because you cannot fathom that someone like me belongs here as much as you. Maybe more. The chamber buzzed. Her words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a reckoning. She wasn't answering Cruz for herself. She was answering for everyone he had tried to silence, dismiss, or erase. Cruz interrupted, his voice sharp. This is grandstanding, Congresswoman. You're playing to the cameras. Jasmine didn't blink. If holding you accountable is grandstanding, then I'll gladly stand tall. Because unlike you, I don't fear the truth being televised. The chamber erupted with murmurs, a mix of shock and admiration. Even those who didn't agree with her politics couldn't deny the precision of her strike. Cruz tried to laugh, but it came out hollow, forced. Jasmine leaned in, her voice low and cutting. You mock me because I refuse to play your game. You insult me because I won't bow to your arrogance. But here's the truth you cannot escape. Your time of smirking and skating by on bluster is ending. And what you see standing before you is the reason why. She paused. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, electric, alive. Everyone waited. And then she delivered the line that would echo far beyond those chamber walls. You can sneer at me, Senator Cruz, but you cannot silence me. Because I represent millions whose voices you've ignored, whose lives you've dismissed, whose dignity you've trampled, and we are done being quiet. The room broke. Applause erupted from her allies, gasps from the gallery. Even some across the aisle sat frozen, stunned by the force of her words. Cruz's face tightened, his smirk gone entirely now, replaced with something he couldn't disguise. Discomfort. Jasmine didn't stop. She had more to say, and she knew this was her moment. You accuse me of not being serious? Let's talk about seriousness. Serious is showing up for your constituents, not fleeing them in times of crisis. Serious is working to solve problems, not manufacturing outrage for sound bites. Serious is knowing that leadership is service, not theater. And by that standard, Senator, I am deadly serious. More serious than you have ever been. It was surgical, every sentence cut deeper. She wasn't just dismantling his insult. She was dismantling his entire persona piece by piece, until nothing remained but the hollowness of his arrogance. Cruz opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came. For the first time, Ted Cruz, the man who never ran out of words, was silent. Jasmine let that silence linger, savoring it, before she delivered the final blow. History doesn't belong to those who sneer. It belongs to those who stand. And today, Senator Cruz, you've reminded us all why history will not remember your smirk, but it will remember this moment. The chamber thundered with reaction, applause, cheers, even stunned silence from those who couldn't bring themselves to clap. Cruz sat back, his face pale, his arrogance stripped bare. He had walked into the chamber confident he would dominate, but he had underestimated the power of authenticity, resilience, and truth. Jasmine Crockett had not only defended herself, she had defined herself, and in doing so, she had exposed Ted Cruz in a way no opponent ever had. The cameras caught it. Clips would soon ricochet across social media. Headlines would scream of her takedown, and Cruz's carefully cultivated persona of dominance would forever carry the scar of this moment. But in that chamber, in that silence that followed her words, it was clear the battle had shifted, and for the first time, Ted Cruz was no longer the loudest voice in the room. What came next would not just decide the debate, it would decide who controlled the narrative of an entire movement. The silence in the chamber stretched on like a held breath, then broke in a roar. Applause, murmurs, even the sharp crack of a gavel trying to restore order. But it was too late. The energy had shifted, and everyone knew it. Cruz leaned back, forcing his features into a mask of indifference, but the flush on his face betrayed him. His silence, so rare, so uncharacteristic, was louder than any insult he had hurled. Jasmine Crockett had turned his weapon back on him, and the chamber itself felt it. Within minutes, phones buzzed. Staffers who had filmed the exchange were already sending clips to reporters. By the time Cruz adjusted his tie and tried to look unfazed, the first headlines were already live. Crockett silences Cruz in stunning exchange. Ted Cruz mocked, left speechless by Jasmine. Crockett, on social media the moment detonated. Twitter exploded with hashtags. You're Crockett clapback. Silent Cruz. History in the making. Clips of her words, delivered with that calm steel, were reposted thousands of times within the hour. Memes appeared almost instantly. One showed Cruz's face, photoshopped into a mime's costume, mouth taped shut, captioned, "For once he found his silence." Another showed Jasmine in superhero armor, standing over the ruins of a broken smirk. TikTok lit up with creators reenacting the exchange, pausing at her mic drop line. History doesn't belong to those who sneer. It belongs to those who stand. That single sentence was clipped and stitched into motivational edits, layered over music that made it sound like the climax of a movie. For millions watching, it wasn't just politics anymore. It was inspiration. But the ripple effect wasn't confined to social media. Late-night hosts pounced on the footage, weaving it into their monologues. One joked, "Ted Cruz, ladies and gentlemen. Usually he leaves us speechless." This time, Jasmine Crockett returned the favor. The studio audience erupted with laughter, but beneath the humor was something deeper, a recognition that a shift had happened. Cable news panels dissected the moment endlessly. Conservative commentators tried to spin it, muttering about grandstanding, but even they struggled to hide how rattled Cruz looked in the footage. Liberal commentators, meanwhile, hailed it as a turning point. This wasn't just a takedown, one analyst said. This was a generational torch being passed. Crockett represents a new wave of politics, unapologetic, authentic, and unafraid. The chamber itself wasn't immune. Lawmakers who had dismissed Jasmine as a firebrand found themselves whispering in hallways, acknowledging that she had landed a blow few could. Some privately admitted they wished they'd had the courage to say what she said, in the way she said it. Others begrudgingly warned each other, "Don't underestimate her again." Meanwhile, Cruz scrambled. His staff rushed to draft statements, but every attempt rang hollow. He tweeted hours later, trying to brush off the moment with a snide joke. But the replies flooded in with video clips of him sitting silent, his smirk erased. The ratio was brutal. His words were drowned in GIFs, memes, and hashtags that turned his attempt at control into another humiliation. And Jasmine, she didn't gloat. She didn't even mention Cruz by name when she spoke to reporters that evening. Instead, she reframed it. "What I said wasn't about one man," she told the cameras. "It was about who gets to be heard in America and who gets dismissed. It was about dignity, and that belongs to all of us." That humility, that refusal to make it just about Cruz, only amplified her power. She wasn't just the woman who silenced Ted Cruz. She was the voice that carried the weight of something larger, a movement that had long been waiting for a moment like this. And across the country, people felt it. Immigrants, young voters, those who had grown tired of politics as performance, they saw themselves in her words. They shared the clip not because it was funny, though it was, but because it was validating. Because it proved that arrogance could be challenged, that authenticity could win. Cruz had entered the chamber certain he would dominate, certain he would humiliate her. Instead, he had become the symbol of what was fading, the old guard of mockery and theater. Jasmine had become the face of what was rising, truth spoken plainly, fiercely, with no apology. But even as the applause, the hashtags, the headlines spread like wildfire, one truth lingered in the air. This moment was not the end. It was only the beginning, because if one exchange in one chamber could ripple across the nation like this, what would happen when Jasmine, and those like her, kept standing, kept speaking, kept refusing to be silenced? The answer was coming, and Ted Cruz, along with the rest of the country, would soon find out. In the days that followed, The clip of Jasmine Crockett's takedown of Ted Cruz spread far beyond Washington. It wasn't just political junkies replaying it, it was teachers showing it to their students, activists sharing it at community meetings, and ordinary people sending it to family group chats with pride. What resonated wasn't just the fact that she had silenced Cruz, though that alone was remarkable. It was how she had done it, not by matching insult with insult, but by standing taller, steadier, and truer than her opponent. Her words cut through because they weren't just about her. They were about everyone who had ever been mocked, dismissed, or underestimated. She turned his sneer into a mirror, reflecting back the arrogance that had poisoned public life for too long. And in that reflection, America saw a choice. On one side, the politics of smirks, soundbites, and division. On the other, the politics of dignity, courage, and inclusion. Jasmine herself framed it best when she spoke days later at a town hall. What happened in that chamber wasn't about versus him, she told the crowd. It was about who we want to be as a country. Do we keep rewarding arrogance, or do we finally lift up authenticity? Do we settle for mockery, or do we demand respect? Do we accept silence, or do we insist that every voice matters? The crowd erupted in cheers, but then she grew quiet, and her next words carried a weight that stilled the room. I came from a family that knew struggle. I've been told all my life to sit down, to wait my turn, to lower my voice. But I didn't, because I knew that if I stayed silent, someone else would lose their chance to speak too. That's what this is about. None of us should have to wait our turn for dignity. It was more than a political statement. It was a moral one. She was reminding America that respect isn't a privilege to be earned at the whim of the powerful. It is a right. Even commentators who rarely agreed on anything found themselves aligning on this point. Some called her response a defining moment of truth. Others said it was a lesson in leadership. What united them was the acknowledgement that Jasmine had elevated the exchange beyond politics. She had turned it into a parable. Because what her confrontation revealed was timeless. Bullies rely on noise, but truth relies on courage. And courage, once voiced, reverberates far beyond its speaker. Ted Cruz's silence that day wasn't just the silence of one senator caught off guard. It was symbolic, the silence of arrogance finally meeting a voice strong enough to stop it. That was why the clip traveled so far, why it embedded itself in the cultural memory. It wasn't about the spectacle, it was about the lesson, and the lesson was this: dignity is stronger than mockery, service is stronger than theater, truth is stronger than arrogance. The chamber may have been the stage, but the story belonged to everyone who had ever been underestimated and chose to rise. Anyway, Jasmine Crockett's words crystallized into a rallying cry for those who believe in an America that doesn't just tolerate difference, but thrives on it. Her story became proof that history does not belong to those who smirk from their seats. It belongs to those who stand, who speak, who refused to be silenced, and as the headlines faded, as the hashtags cooled, the echo of her words remained. Not as a viral clip, not as a fleeting takedown, but as a reminder that dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken away. The moral was clear. America's crossroads isn't between left and right or red and blue. It is between arrogance and respect, silence and voice, dismissal and dignity. And in that chamber, on that day, Jasmine Crockett showed the world which side she stood on. The key. Clip of Jasmine Crockett's words will be replayed for years to come. Not because it humiliated Ted Cruz, though it did, but because it reminded America of something we too often forget. Power bends to courage. What happened in that chamber was bigger than politics. It was a moment of clarity, a reminder that dignity cannot be mocked out of existence. Jasmine stood tall not just for herself, but for millions who have been told they don't belong, who have been interrupted, silenced, or dismissed. And with calm, unshakable resolve, she proved them wrong. This wasn't just a clapback, it was a declaration. That arrogance has limits, That authenticity has power. That history listens when truth is spoken with courage. And now, the question falls to all of us. What kind of voices will we amplify? Whose stories will we carry forward? Will we keep giving the microphone to those who sneer and divide, or will we stand with those who remind us of our shared dignity? Because this moment is more than viral. It's personal. It's about who we are and who we want to be. So if you felt that spark, if you saw yourself in Jasmine's strength, if you believe in an America where truth stands taller than arrogance, then don't let this story stop here. Share this video, add your voice to the echo, and subscribe so you don't miss the moments that define who we are becoming. Because one thing is certain, Jasmine Crockett's words won't just live in the headlines. They'll live in the choices we make, the voices we lift, and the courage we carry forward. And history will remember.